Mile markers matter more than you think. You've seen them. Little green signs with white numbers. They flash past your car every mile, sometimes barely visible through a windshield smudged with bug guts and road trip despair. You don't notice them. Why would you? They're not there to impress. They're not neon billboards, or scenic overlooks, or even those random roadside attractions like the world's largest ball of yarn. No, they just sit there quietly, whispering things like mile 124 or mile 9, utterly devoid of charisma. But behind their monotony lies purpose. More than purpose, utility. These mile markers are the unsung framework of American road travel. They help emergency responders find you faster when you call in a wreck. They help snowplows know where they've plowed. They tell the Department of Transportation, exactly where to start digging when there's a pothole report. And perhaps most critically, they remind you just how far you are from wherever you started. In a world where GPS screams orders at you and car dashboards offer real-time traffic data and espresso-making capability, the humble mile marker still hangs on. It's analog. It's silent. And it's everywhere. This story is about them, their birth, their awkward teenage years, their rebellious phases, and how they came to be the green little guardians of American road infrastructure. So if you're still awake, barely, buckle up. We're going back in time. Way, way back. To the beginning. From Rome to the New World. Long before Dodge Caravans or Cracker Barrels or rest stops that smell like microwave dreams, there were Roman roads. The Roman Empire had a serious thing for roads and for measuring them. Around 300 BCE, the Romans began installing milliaria, stone markers placed every 1,000 paces along their extensive road network. These weren't random stones. These were official government signage, often inscribed with who built the road, who paid for it, and how far it was to the next major city. Think of them as the world's first bureaucratically blessed mile markers. Julius Caesar himself would have seen these on his way to conquer Gaul, or more likely, while stuck in traffic behind some ox carts. The Roman model influenced road-building philosophy for centuries. When the first English colonists arrived in America, they brought with them more than muskets and religious guilt. They brought an understanding that roads needed measuring. But America was wild. Raw. Messy. The roads weren't really roads. They were dirt paths. Animal tracks. Wagon trails at best. Still, by the 1700s, a few early attempts to emulate Roman mile marking began popping up along trade routes and postal roads in the northeast colonies. Boston's Milestone 1 is a good example. Placed on the old Boston Post Road in the 1720s, this stone marker gave travelers something to orient themselves by, something more official than just counting fence posts or guessing. Most early markers were hand-chiseled from local stone, about as accurate as tossing a rock and saying, "Yeah, that feels like a mile." Did it help? Sort of. Was it consistent? Absolutely not. Because as we'll soon see, defining a mile was an issue all its own. The many miles of early America. Let's talk about the actual length of a mile. It seems simple, right? 5,280 feet. Easy. But back in early colonial America, that number was about as stable as a three-legged cow on a frozen pond. Different colonies, and even counties, had different ideas about how long a mile actually was. The English statute mile, which had been officially defined in 1592 as 5,280 feet, was technically the standard. But enforcement in the colonies? Laughable. Massachusetts had its own variation. Pennsylvania? Same story. Even as far back as the 17th century, people argued about whether a mile should be 1,000 paces, 8 furlongs, or just whatever distance your uncle claimed it took to get to the pub. There's even record of early surveyors using chains, literally, chains, as a unit of measure. The Gunter's chain, invented in 1620, measured 66 feet in length, and 80 of them made up a mile. Which sounds fine until you realize most surveyors weren't math majors and couldn't be bothered to do all that counting in the field. So imagine you're a poor traveler in 1763, walking between Philadelphia and Lancaster. 1 mile marker says mile 10, but the next one shows up 0.85 miles later. Was it wrong? Were you just tired? Had the earth moved? No one knew. But they knew one thing: it made long-distance travel and trade frustrating as hell. To add to the drama, weather often destroyed early wooden or stone markers. Floods washed them away. Vandals moved them. And some just sank into the mud and were never seen again. Every mile became more like a suggestion than a measurement. That didn't stop the post office, of course. As early as the late 1700s, they began using mile measurements to calculate rates and delivery estimates. So, naturally, inconsistencies in marker placement led to inconsistencies in postage, and people began to complain. Loudly. It was messy. But America would soon enter a period where roads became more than just muddy lines on a map. They became profitable. And that changed everything. Turnpikes, tolls, and timber posts. By the early 1800s, America had entered its capitalistic adolescence. Roads were bad, still muddy, still inconsistent, but the country was growing. Trade was increasing. Farmers needed better ways to get goods to markets. So, naturally, private companies smelled opportunity. Enter the turnpike. A turnpike was basically a pay-to-play road. A private company would build a road. Maybe even slap some gravel down if they were feeling fancy. And then put up a gate, literally a turnpike, that you couldn't pass without paying a toll. Sometimes it was a few cents. Sometimes it was an entire day's wages if you were unlucky or had a particularly smug toll-keeper. These companies needed to justify their tolls, which meant proving how long the road was. Which meant, finally, mile markers were back in the spotlight. Wooden posts became common. These markers were often crude, a slab of wood stuck in the dirt with a number carved or painted on. If it said mile 7, that meant you were 7 miles from the toll booth or another fixed point, usually the start of the road or a major town. Some companies got creative. There are historical accounts of mile markers being used for advertising, only 3 miles to Thompson's Tavern or fresh cider at mile 12. Some toll-keepers were known to exaggerate the length of their road, sneaking in extra markers to squeeze a few more coins out of travelers. And since nobody had Google Maps, most people didn't notice, or couldn't do anything about it if they did. Still, these posts gave travelers something to rely on. They could pace their journeys. They could track their progress. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time, roads felt somewhat navigable. Some of the markers from this era even survive in museums or as local landmarks, standing as proof that Americans have been overthinking distances for more than 2 centuries. Precision arrives on rails. The 1830s brought a transportation revolution that forever changed the American approach to distance: railroads. Suddenly, mile measurements weren't just helpful, they were essential. Trains needed exact timing. Switch operators needed precise distances. Freight calculations, arrival schedules, and ticket pricing all depended on one thing: accuracy. Rail companies, unlike early toll road operators, had a financial incentive to get miles right. They hired professional surveyors to mark every mile with stone or cast iron markers. The term a milepost became common parlance, and it still lives on in railway lingo today. Each milepost along a railway line indicated how far a train was from a specific origin point, usually a hub city or junction. The markers were placed with obsessive precision, often measured multiple times. Some were even double-checked with astronomical observations. Because if a train was running even a few hundred feet off schedule, the consequences could be catastrophic. Highways took note. Engineers and planners in the late 19th century began incorporating railroad practices into road building, including the more consistent use of mile markers. But true systemization wouldn't come until the 20th century, when a certain motor vehicle came along and changed absolutely everything. Cars, chaos, and the call for order. By the early 20th century, the automobile was no longer a novelty reserved for eccentric rich men and mad inventors. Henry Ford's Model T rolled off the assembly line in 1908, and suddenly, middle-class Americans had the means to leave their front porches and find adventure, or at least a decent sandwich, somewhere far away. This changed everything. Roads exploded in importance, but they did so in the worst way, chaotically. Local governments built roads how they saw fit. State lines marked the end of one road standard and the beginning of a completely different one. You could be driving west on one road, cross into another county, and suddenly find yourself on a gravel mess labeled with a different name, a different route number, or no signage at all. And the mile markers? Laughable. Some places had wooden posts. Others had painted rocks. Most rural routes had nothing. Drivers depended on word-of-mouth directions like, go 3 miles past the old red barn and hang a left at the tree that looks like it's judging you. As cars grew faster and roads longer, this wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. With the rise in traffic accidents, lawmakers and motorists alike began demanding a more standardized approach. Enter the 1916 Federal Aid Road Act. It was the government's first real attempt to bring order to the madness. And while it didn't solve everything, it set the stage for the next big leap: numbered highways. The U.S. numbered highway system and the rise of uniformity. In 1926, the Joint Board on Interstate Highways, yes, that was a thing, introduced the U.S. numbered highway system. Highways like U.S. Route 1, Route 66, and Route 20 came into existence. Suddenly, instead of winding roads named after local landmarks or founders' pets, there were numbered routes that stretched across states. And with this change came a renewed emphasis on mile markers. States were encouraged, though not required, to install consistent mileposts starting from a designated point, usually the western or southern border of the state. The markers were placed every mile, numbered sequentially, and usually made of wood, concrete, or steel. The idea was that travelers could always know how far they'd gone, and emergency services could pinpoint a location with more accuracy. The markers were now part of a larger, government-influenced infrastructure plan. Some states resisted standardization at first, looking at Alabama, but by the late 1930s, uniformity started to spread. Road atlases began to reflect the milepost system. Truckers used them. Roadside businesses began advertising their distance from key mile markers. And yet, it still wasn't perfect. The signs were vulnerable to weather, vandalism, and the whims of local budgets. many states still didn't install them on smaller routes. But progress was happening. Slowly. Painfully. Mile by mile. The interstate era, the Green Age, begins. Then came Dwight D. Eisenhower. The supreme commander of Allied forces in World War II had returned to America with one giant complaint: the roads here were trash. After witnessing Germany's high-speed autobahns, Ike realized the strategic and commercial value of a proper national road network. Thus, in 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act gave birth to the interstate highway system. It was a marvel: 41,000 plus miles of high-speed, limited-access roads that would forever transform how Americans moved, lived, and vacationed. And finally, the mile marker got its due. As part of the system, uniform green mile markers were mandated on interstates. Each interstate would begin its mile count at the southern or western border of the state, increasing numerically as you traveled north or east. The markers became metal, standardized in shape and font, and placed precisely every mile. Exit numbers soon followed suit, matching the nearest mile marker, so exit 240? That meant mile 240. It was revolutionary. Emergency responders could pinpoint accidents. Truckers could time deliveries. Drivers could actually pace themselves on long road trips without relying on sketchy math or emotional support snacks. The green mile marker became iconic. Functional. Reassuring. And unlike many trends of the 50s, it stuck around. The digital age, competition and cooperation. Then the future happened. By the 1990s, GPS became available to civilians. Early versions were clunky, slow, and deeply wrong. Ever been told to turn left into a lake? Classic 1997 Garmin move. But they evolved quickly. Smartphones soon came equipped with real-time location tracking, and mile markers faced their biggest identity crisis yet. Why care about a green metal sign every mile when your phone tells you exactly where you are, how long until the next turn, and what temperature it is in Cleveland? And yet, the mile marker endured. Why? Because it was real. It didn't rely on a signal. It wasn't a screen. It couldn't be hacked or drained of battery. Emergency services still trained using mile markers. Traffic reports still used them. Road crews depended on them to log repairs. And for road-weary drivers, they were small, analog victories. Proof that yes, you are still getting somewhere. The mile marker in 2025, quiet relevance. As of 2025, mile markers are still quietly doing their job. The green signs now sometimes feature reflective coating, solar-powered lighting, and smart sensor add-ons. In some urban areas, digital overlays track mile marker data for traffic flow and predictive maintenance. High-tech vehicles, from delivery trucks to self-driving cars, still use mile marker data to validate GPS positions. Logistics companies log shipments by marker. Local dots track maintenance, roadkill reports, and snowplow activity with them. And while most travelers still don't notice them, they're more important than ever. Especially during storms, outages, and system failures, when cell towers go down, or when rural drivers can't get a signal, mile markers are the most reliable navigation tool still standing. They don't beep. They don't update firmware. They just sit there, mile after mile, telling you you're not lost. You're just between things. In praise of the mundane. So here's to the most overlooked piece of American road infrastructure. Not the bridges. Not the tunnels. Not the glamour shots of Route 66 or the mind-numbing drama of IR-95. But the humble mile marker. The quiet companion. The unblinking witness to all the weirdness we haul up and down the nation's roads. It never demanded attention. It just showed up every mile.